Alright, so welcome back for part 3. In this video we're going to talk about setting up the roughness map, the metal map, and the normal, or at least a basic normal for now. So we're going to discuss roughness values and what they mean in Unreal Engine and what roughness means, and we're also going to set up a map. We're going to do the same thing with metal. We're going to talk about having metal off and on and give ourselves the ability to make that switch in the engine in real time, and also talk about using maps. We're going to talk about mask and how we can use mask to multiply against other functions to define where we want the pixels information to come through and where we don't. We're going to set up our basic normal map parameter, and we're going to create a little math equation that's going to help control our normal intensity so that we can go in the engine and we can ramp up the intensity non-destructively. We're also going to discuss clamps and what they mean, how they can be beneficial at times, and just overall basic fundamental math that you'll be using just throughout your process of making materials with Unreal Engine 4. Alright, so let's move on to part 3. Okay, so in this video we want to go ahead and tackle roughness. And this is going to go by fairly quickly, so we'll probably go ahead and tackle roughness, metallic, and normal. But before we get too far into things, let's go ahead and talk about how roughness works in physical-based rendering. So basically, some engines use gloss, some use roughness, and roughness is basically the inverted value of a gloss. So in a gloss map, a value of white, which is equal to 1, would be all the way glossy. In a roughness map, a value of white, or a value of 1, it's all the way rough. So gloss would actually be black. Okay, so we're going to start to demonstrate this by using a value. And roughness only needs a single value to work. It's a grayscale system if you were using a map. So let's go ahead and start with that scalar parameter that we used over here for our fraction and our desaturation. And let's go ahead and create one for roughness. So again, I'm going to hold S on the keyboard and left click, and again I held it too long. And we're going to type in roughness base value. Alright, we're just going to go ahead and plug that in, and it's already a parameter because we started off as a scalar. We'll come down here and create a, actually we don't want to create a new group, we just want to plug this into base. And our default value for roughness was actually, it was 0.5. Alright, so we talked about having default values before, and it's 0.5. And so when we plug this in, it should have gotten extremely glossy. But what's happening is we never stopped previewing the desaturation node over here. So let me go back up to that, and we'll right click on that and we'll say stop previewing node. Okay, and that just brings back our normal instruction for our base color. And now what we can see is when we changed our roughness value, so I'll just unplug it by holding Alt left click, you can see that it's kind of semi-matte right here, it's 0.5. And when I plug this in, it gets extremely glossy. Okay, if I were to go into the details panel and turn this value up to 1, you can see that it's completely matte. And the thing is no matter how far past when I go, it doesn't matter. So if I go to 100, we see no change. If I go to negative 100, it's the same as 0. Okay, so it's clamped at 0 and 1. So what we can do is we can put that in the description box. We can say roughness value, and then we can just put 0 to 1. Okay, and we have that in the correct group, and I just want to set it at 0.5 for a default value, so that we're not looking at something extremely shiny all the time by default. We'll go ahead and apply this. Okay, and we'll go back to our scene, hit F11, and what I want to do right now is come in here to the base, and we'll select the option to modify, and we can turn this down in real time. Okay, which is really nice. And so we can get this really glossy, kind of shiny result with some screen space reflections and the sphere capture working in there, so we're getting some really nice results. And it's just that easy, and oops, I accidentally duplicated something. It's really easy to get this result, and we could turn that back up to 0.5 to see something more natural. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to go ahead and give ourselves the ability, just like we did with the albedo, to use a texture. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this switch by holding Control W, and we're going to say in the description box activates roughness base texture. And now we want to create a new group, and we want this to be roughness. Oops, one more S there. Okay. So if it's true, then we need a texture, which is actually this texture here. So we'll just copy it because I grabbed the wrong texture to begin with. All right, we'll just copy that, and we'll call this one roughness. And that, of course, goes in the roughness group. All right. And the description for that would be base roughness texture. All right. And so if true, if has roughness texture, then that. And if false, then we want to use the value. And the last thing we need to do is set our switch up. So the switch is in roughness group already. We just need to retitle it roughness. I guess I left that out. All right. We'll grab this whole thing, left mouse click drag, hit C on the keyboard, we'll comment, and we will call this entire group roughness. All right, we'll move that out of the way. Go ahead and apply that, and let's go back in here. All right, so right now I'm using a value. If I go to my material instance, I can control this value underneath base. All right, set that back to default and then check. And actually, I'm recognizing right now that we actually put the switch in the wrong spot. So I'm going to go back to the switch, and I actually want that switch to be under base. And as we move along, it'll begin to make more sense what this base is. And this base is kind of your control center, so to speak. So if I go back under base and I tell it that I want to use a roughness, left click, it will open up my roughness panel, and now we have the appropriate roughness values taking effect in here. And so we're starting to look like something a little bit more realistic now. All right, and that's pretty much all we want to do with the roughness right now for the time being. So let's go ahead back into the material, and let's do the same thing for a metallic. So the metallic is fairly self-explanatory. If you have a value of 1 in metal, then it will render it as if it were metal. If you have a value of 0, then it's not metal, and anything in between is not really recommended. But there are cases, say for example you have metal that's been sitting around for 20 years and it's really dusty on top. Well, then you might want to use a metallic mask to help you kind of separate that material definition. So what we need is we actually need the same exact setup here. We need a comment box, and inside of it we want our metalness mask, and then we want a metal value, and then we want the toggle. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to grab this whole thing, and we'll save real quick. We're going to hit Control W on the keyboard and just duplicate the entire thing. Alright, we need to be thorough here and come back and make sure that we retitle everything. So if I click on my comment box, I can just retitle this to Metalness. Alright, we'll change our roughness base to metal base, and we'll create a new group, metal. Alright, and under the description we'll say base metal texture. Alright, so that's that one. Under the roughness base value, we want to use metal base value. We want to keep it in the base group, and we want to call this metal value down here. Alright, and then finally the switch. We want that to stay in the base, but we want it to say has metalness. Oh, we'll just say has metalness. Alright, and we want to say this activates the metalness base texture. Alright, and it looks like misspelled here. Alright, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and set this at a default of 0, which is the engine default. So you'll notice that our material, as we're looking at it, is not metal, and we want to keep it that way for the time being. And I want to show you the difference it makes. Okay, so right now we're not looking at a metal surface. When I change this value to 1, you can see it makes a huge difference. I mean, you've got some really nice kind of Fresnel and some different specular values, and it really works really well. And there's usually, this is something that can be quite a trick to achieve, and this engine does it for you. So we'll go ahead and set that back to default. We'll go ahead and apply everything, go to our material instance, and let's take a look inside the editor. So right now with the value of 0 for metalness, it looks as it should. And if we go to base and we change the metalness value to 1, you can see that now this is going to act like metal. Alright. And anything in between, again, is just going to give you some kind of weird, not quite metal, not quite not metal results, and sometimes that can be desired, but for the most case you want to stay at 0 or 1. So we'll put that back at default. Alright, and finally let's go ahead and do a setup for our normal map as well. Alright, so we'll come back to specular and emissive in the next one, and we'll also tackle ambient occlusion. But for now we really need to go ahead and tackle normal. So here's how we're going to do normal. Normal, there's some intensity that we want to be able to affect. I'm just going to move some stuff out of the way and make some room real quick. We want to be able to change the intensity of our normal map, and that can be a little bit tricky to set up. But with some basic math principles, I think we can fly through this quite quickly. So first things first, let's go ahead and set up a normal map. So I'm just going to hold 2 on the, I'm going to right click and type in 2D and pull the texture sample parameter 2D in. And we're going to call this normal base. Okay, and we're going to go over here, hit F11, go into our content browser and grab the cobblestone normal. And we'll come in here and hit our white arrow and pull that in. Alright, so we can go ahead and plug that in and apply, and we can see that it's that simple to get our normal map up and running. So now we have a full-blown material with all of our textures up and running, and we could literally instance this material over and over again and basically create most of the content in our game with just this simple setup. Okay, and that's just the power of material instancing, and because it's already been compiled, they'll be essentially free to you, and that's just a really good way to go about setting up a base material. But what if, say for example, I wanted to beef up the normal without having to go to Photoshop and you know, do any trickery in there to kind of give myself some more Z depth? What if I just want to do it right here in the engine? Well, we can do that. I'm going to show you how. Alright, so to get started with this, let's go back into the engine. And let's bring our normal over here and let's give ourselves some space to work. Alright, and before we get too far, let's go ahead and create a new group for normal. And let's go ahead and put in the description box that this is the normal base texture. Okay. And we'll go ahead and save this. As a matter of fact, this is probably a good time to go ahead and save everything. Alright, so we'll just go up here to File, Save All, make sure we got our bases covered. Alright, so for this normal texture, just like anything, we'll double click and open up the texture editor. So if we click on our node here, and then go down to the texture and click twice, it will actually pull up the texture editor where we can see this normal, and we can actually break down the channels. Okay, so what's important about a normal is that the blue channel kind of serves as a base, and it's really the green and the red channel that bring in most of the lighting information. So if we take a look at the red channel, what we're getting is left to right lighting information. If we take a look at the green channel, we're getting top to bottom lighting information. Okay, and if we look at the blue channel, it's kind of an overall lighting information. And just as a side note, we don't have to do it here, but if you are importing your own normal maps, make sure that the green channel is flipped. You can do it in the engine as well, flip green channel right here. So if I go ahead and look at everything, this one is already flipped properly, but this is what a normal map looks like. So the highlight should be on the top side. And when you flip it, it almost looks inverted. It looks like it should be protruding into it. And that's the way that the tangent system works in this engine. So just a little side note there, you can do it in the engine, you can do it in whatever application you're using before you export to the engine. But just be wary of that. So having said that, that means that we understand that we want to manipulate the green and the red channel, right? And so in order to beef that up, we want to multiply. But we don't want to multiply all 3 channels. We just want to multiply the red and the green. So let's go ahead and create a multiply node, and let's move this output over here because this is where we're going to end up. And let's plug this into A. Now the problem with this is we said earlier that we can't multiply two values by 3. So that causes a problem because we have a blue channel here that we don't want to multiply, but yet there has to be a value there in order to use this multiplication node. Okay, so to demonstrate this, what we're going to do is we're going to create a constant 3 by holding 3 on the keyboard and left clicking, and we're going to plug this into the multiply. And we're going to hit this drop down arrow and we'll say enable real-time preview. Alright, so because we're multiplying by 0, what we're getting is a black result. If we come in here and we set these all to 1, we're multiplying by 1, and anything multiplied by 1 is obviously the same. And so we're not seeing much change. As a matter of fact, we're not seeing any change. Okay, so when we look at this, we're still getting the normal map as it should be. Alright, and to further amplify this, let's go ahead and start previewing this node. Alright, so here's our normal map. Just as far as pixel information goes, you won't see light interact with it this way. It's just kind of showing you the pixel information. So if I come in here and I multiply the blue channel by, let's say, 10, what you'll see is that nothing really changes. The image gets brighter, and that's because of the bloom taking effect because we've pushed the value beyond 1. But other than that, we're not really seeing anything happen. And if we go to stop previewing node, alright, and we turn this back to 1, we can see our normal map. And if we turn this back to 10, what's actually happened is we've flattened the normal, which is not what we want. So we can kind of tell, we can just barely see some normal information there if you look really hard, like right there. We're flattening the normal, and that's because we're adding up all those layers of base normal, and that's not what we want. We want to keep this at 1. Okay, so let's go back to previewing this node. Now let's go over here to this, and let's multiply our R channel by 10. Alright, and our green channel by 10, and you can see the effect taking place. And I tell you what, let's just turn this down a little bit. Let's try 5 and 5. Okay, that's a little bit better. Alright, so if I stop previewing this node now, you can see that essentially what's happened is we've beefed up our normal. Okay, but this is kind of aggravating because we could convert this into a parameter, and then you could go on the engine and you could open it up and you could just know to yourself, or we could write in the description box, don't type anything for blue, only multiply red and green. But this could be kind of aggravating and be kind of hard to iterate quickly if you had to sit here and say, okay, that's too much, let's try 4.8. Let's try 4.6. Let's try 4. Let's try 3. So what we want to do is be able to use a slider to manipulate this. So that means we need a little bit more math between here and here, because we need to drop this third value. As a matter of fact, we don't even need the third value. So let's delete this, and let's just create a constant 2 by holding 2 on the keyboard, and let's plug this in. Okay, so we get that error I was talking about, and I just want to demonstrate this really quick. We can't do it because we don't have enough values here. Okay, we don't have enough values. We're multiplying 2 against 3, and it doesn't know what to do with the third value. All right, so let's go ahead and break that. So eventually we're going to have to add a value back to this, but for now let's just focus on raising both of these values simultaneously, which represent our red and green. All right, so to do this, let's introduce another multiply node by holding M on the keyboard. Let's plug this into A, and let's create a scalar parameter by holding S, and we'll call this normal intensity. Alright, we'll plug this into B. Alright, so first of all, our R and G channel need to be represented accurately, and they should be 1, right? We don't want to multiply by 0 because that would cancel it out. And even though we're multiplying this against that, we're also multiplying this against that. So if this is a 0, it will cancel that back to 0 anyway, which would still give us the same result of canceling everything out. So we want everything when multiplying to be a default of 1. And basically, you can multiply by 1 all day, no matter how many times you do it, you're still going to get the same result. And that's where you want your default to be. So now what happens is, if I were to look at this, I have yellow because we have a red value of 1 and a green value of 1, and we don't have any blue. Okay, and if I were to come over here and multiply this by 2 or 3, oops, or on up, you can see that nothing's happening, and that's because we are multiplying those at the same time. So we're always getting the same input. Alright, so let's go back to 1. Alright, so what this means is that we could then plug this into here, and every time we multiply this, it's going to multiply both of those digits, which is then multiplying both of these digits. So this is in turn affecting both of these. But the problem still remains that we don't have the third value. So what we need to do is we need to add one. And when I say add, I don't mean the addition. If we hold A on the keyboard, there is actually an add node. That's not what we want. We want what's called an append. So if we right click and type in append, basically what this does is there's no math involved. It just literally appends it to the math. So if we plug this into spot A, all right, and plug this in now. Now we have those two numbers coming in, and all we need is one additional number to represent blue that's not being filtered through this multiply. It's going to stay constant all the time. So we can just hold 1 on the keyboard and create a constant 1. And we don't need it to be a scalar parameter because we're never going to change it. So we can set the default to 1 here, and we can apply this. And now what's happening is we have a value of 1, 1, and 1, and you can see our multiply works. Okay. So now, as I turn this up, you can see that it's multiplying our red and green channel and then adding the blue channel, which is always a value of 1, and we get an intensified normal effect. So let's go ahead and turn this back to 1. Let's make sure that our normal intensity parameter is inside of the normal map. All right, and let's clean this math up just a little bit and make some sense out of this. Okay, really important to stay organized as much as possible because later on in this project we're going to have nodes all over the place. Okay, and so we understand a little bit of what's happening. Let's left select everything, left click drag select, and we'll call this normal. Kind of position everything, a little bit better inside here. And we'll go ahead and we'll hit save, which will force and apply. We don't want to lose our work here. Now let's go into the editor and hit F11. Okay, so we have our roughness, we have our albedo, and we have our normal, and we have our metalness set to 0. Let's close this normal, and let's pull up the material instance. And now when we go into normal, we can select this normal intensity, and on the fly, we can begin to bulge this normal intensity out. Alright, so you can see that taking place in real time, which is nice, and it actually comes in handy quite often. Likewise, if you want to dull it down a little bit, right, if you want to flatten those stones out a little bit, we could do that fairly easily. Alright, and if you go below 0, what's going to happen? It's going to invert. Alright, so now the stones are now beveling in. And so there's a way to get around that if we don't want to use it, and I'll leave this up to you. In my case, I'm going to leave it open. Because I think that it could be valuable to be able to invert your normal, not in this case, but it could be. But for the sake of demonstration, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce what's called a clamp. So if we right click and type in clamp, so this is a piece of math that basically will take whatever happens before it and clamp it between two values. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to take all of this and move it over. We don't want to clamp that. What we want to clamp is this normal intensity. We don't want people to go below 0 because, well, then, you know, they could invert our normal. So what we'll do is the minimum default can stay 0. And we'll just set the max default something high like 1,000. And we'll go ahead and plug this in. And we will multiply that and we'll apply. Alright, and that's not going to do anything inside of our material instance other than when we take our normal intensity down, 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 now you can see that when I go into the negative, it doesn't read those digits anymore. It just keeps it at 0. No matter how far I go, it keeps it at 0. All right, and that's nice to have. And that might be worth noting in the description box that it is clamped. So we'll go ahead and we'll type in, we'll type in normal intensity, and then we'll type in 0 to 1,000. Alright. Now you might be asking, what is the min and the max here? Well, sometimes when you create a node, let's say a multiply node, you can see that it gives you digits. It assumes the A and the B input. So it assumes that A is 0 and B is 1. So if you wanted to multiply something by 0, you could plug it into the B and it will multiply it by a default value of 0 for A. Now so far we've always told the engine what we want to use. Okay, but we could come down here and we could just change the constants that are already plugged in. Now the reason we have this min max is because we can click on it and we can change the min max default inside of the details panel. But if we wanted to give the user control over it, we could actually plug in a scalar parameter to the minimum here and say minimum normal intensity clamp, which would give the end user the ability to then take it below 0. In most cases, it's a little bit redundant because you could just take it off and they could just know that they could put it at 0 manually and not have to worry about inverting. But there are specific cases where this could come in handy. So once again, we'll tidy everything up just a little bit. I think I made a little bit too much room. And we'll go ahead and apply this. And we'll come into the editor and hit File, Save All. And we'll go back into our material and move on to the next tutorial, which will be discussing the emissive channel and how we can get some cool effects out of that and kind of simulate lighting in our environment.